today. Thanks for joining. I'm excited. You guys have seen the promo around Jennifer jumping in, and we can kind of shift the trajectory where we normally go and have a different type of discussion that's just as important today. So feel free as we go through this discussion to post your questions in the chat. Our streaming platform usually lets us see the questions as we come along. If we see them, we can respond and I can ask Jennifer the questions. If not, we can loop back around in the comments and address them there. But yeah, I want to introduce to you Jennifer Alumbaugh.
Yes.
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 I am the worst with names. I'm so excited.
No worries.
Awesome. So I wanted to let you know Jennifer is a neuroinclusion accessibility consultant, speaker, and coach. And I know that's a lot, and we're going to dive just into that. We're going to find out what does all of that mean, all the dopeness that I've learned about Jennifer in this short period of time. I think it's been like 2 or 3 months now since we connected. Online, which it's funny, I usually prefer in-person networking, but this online space has been such a dope place to be and meet awesome people like you that I would have never met outside. So we live so far. So yeah, I appreciate that. So awesome. Let's jump right in, Jennifer.
Yes.
I want to start by, if you could just introduce yourself, give us some background, and we'll start there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here and love talking about this any opportunity I can. So thank you for holding this space. So my name is Jennifer. I am a retired complex trauma therapist of 15 years. I retired a year ago in order to just kind of shift my focus more into the neuroinclusion consulting, advocacy, and speaking. One of the things that inspired me to shift more into this work is my own journey into coming into awareness of my autistic, ADHD, and a variety of other neurodivergences later in life. So several years ago, at the age of 42, I came into awareness of my autistic ADHD identity, and those are kind of the two main pieces that I talk about most, but also under my personal neurodivergent umbrella is also things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, different kinds of like auditory processing, sensory processing issues like that. And as I was coming into my identity, many of my clients were coming into their neurodivergent identity. And I noticed patterns of, a lot of the time it's women, a lot of the time it's femme people, Black, Indigenous, women of color who are coming into their identity later in life because of all of the systemic reasons that these identities get overlooked for everything else. And so there's right now, this period of time or this moment in time, there is a huge surge in people coming into their neurodivergent energy, and identity. A lot of that has to do with the access that we have to language and hearing people's narratives about what their lived experience is. And this is part of my story too. And as I listen to people on TikTok and in lives and different conversations, I began to see myself in the stories that they were sharing. And it made me curious to explore my own, what that meant for me. And so while there can be a lot of people throwing around like, oh, suddenly everybody's ADHD now in 2023, it's not so much that suddenly everybody is ADHD. It's more that between the pandemic and social media and more conversations and visibility around the diverse ways in which neurodiversity shows up in people, especially in, diverse race, gender, and other identities. Because of that visibility, more people are able to connect to it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And you do hear people just throwing around the diagnosis, and it can appear very insensitive at times. I know even for me, for someone who does that. But let's say someone is feeling that type of way and they just don't know where to begin, or maybe they're embarrassed because there has been the stigma behind it,
Mhm.
and people are just learning and hearing more and being open to those diagnoses. What advice and what approach would you give them?
Yeah, I love this question. So, one of the things that I think is valuable in the neurodivergent affirming community and the neurodivergent affirming movement is really the shift from language around diagnosis and disorder to identity. And that's part of that kind of goes with like the disability justice movement as well, moving away from medical model language into, this is part of my identity. This is not a disorder. This is not a disease. There's not a cure. There's not, like I have an autistic therapist who works with other autistics, and she's always writing about, like, I don't treat autism in my therapy sessions. What we address is the trauma around having lived without knowing this piece of identity. What we address is trauma around ableism, both internalized and like being the recipient of ableist behavior, right? So that's one big shift that I it was a big piece for me to learn, right? As a clinician trained in mental health, trained in assessing and diagnosing different aspects of mental health matters. I've had this huge learning curve to readjust my understanding, one, to even come to realize, like, yes, this is me, even though I don't fit like the DSM diagnostic criteria. But understanding historically that's based on a very slim
Yeah.
sliver of population of like white male, right? So the rest of us who don't fall in that category are going to present differently.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that has to do with how we're socialized as in our gender. Sometimes that has to do with how we're socialized just in our families and our culture community. um, so I got sidetracked from your from your question. um, but
No, you didn't get sidetracked. You're spot on. Yeah. No,
um,
I think you're spot on. The only remaining piece was, so how do they speak up and say something in a comfortable setting? Or how do, I guess the real question is, how do business owners and industry leaders make a safe space for people to feel comfortable?
mm, yes, that is the question.
Yeah.
So part of it is, there's the very personal part of the journey as someone comes into their identity and is kind of unlearning old ways of being, learning new ways of being. I experience this, many of my clients experience, like, feeling like, how come I'm becoming like more ADHD and autistic after identifying that than before? And it's not that you're becoming more, but it's more about having identified what it is that's happening, and also, at least for me, being no longer willing to ignore my own needs, right? So the ways that I used to mask certain behaviors or certain needs, say like sensory needs and just like, oh, you know, my whole life I've been told I'm too sensitive. So that messaging results in like, okay, like let me toughen up and just deal with the thing that is frustrating, right? That's one way that I masked in order to accommodate everybody else around me. And since coming into my identity of autistic ADHD, I'm no longer willing to accommodate everybody else by
Yeah.
sacrificing myself. I make that switch. So now I'm beginning to like honor the fact that I have needs and that they are valid. And it is a kindness to myself to meet them as much as possible. And so that does look like a shift in what I'm able to do and accomplish in a day, a shift in, you know, realizing my peak brain activity, creative hours is first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
So I've arranged my schedule. Like that's when I do writing. That's when I, you know, do creative outlining for workshops and talks, things like that. I've learned that because my brain goes all the time without stopping, constant ideas, part of what I need in the middle of the day is a nap in order to just like get my brain to stop and be able to like synthesize all of the input that it's gotten, all of the ideas that are swirling around, and like file that away so that it has room for the the next part of the day. And that's something I used to like be down on myself for, like, oh, like why do you need naps all the time? And now I'm like, no, this is just something that my brain needs. Kind of like I need to plug in my cell phone to recharge it. I need to let my brain take a nap so it can be ready to go.
Yeah.
So I think there's that piece that neurodivergent people may be experiencing in themselves, in like, whoa, okay, I'm like relearning my whole self. I like to describe it like, ooh, now I finally have the correct user manual for my operating system, right? Where before I was like provided a neurotypical operating manual and that wasn't working. And so I was constantly feeling like a failure, constantly working in excess just to try to meet standards that were not meetable. So that's one piece that I think, you know, of course, I'm not asking players like know all of these things, but what I think is valuable is for businesses to understand you may have employees, especially from the transition of work from home to coming back to the office. You may have employees who have identified different needs that they have in order to be successful at their job. And
Yeah.
just because this is a need now and it wasn't a need before doesn't make it any less valid.
Yeah.
Right.
That makes complete sense. I was just gonna jump in and ask. So, because that is a big problem now that people are going back to these hybrid or even forcing some to go fully remote. And the question for that would be, can you give maybe, I don't want to say three, but a few practical steps that a business owner can take that doesn't require a complete overhaul of things? Like, you know, what if I'm a business owner and I'm like, well, I didn't realize that I was that exclusive of not including the people that need to be included in the neurodivergent community. How do I do that? But then I don't know where to begin. And do I need to redo all of my manuals? Like, what practical steps can that type of business owner take?
Yeah, great question. So I think some initial steps can be, you know, something like, for instance, if a business is calling in all their employees back to the office, across the board for every employee. There could just be a survey or a questionnaire that each employee fills out of identifying what supports help them be successful in their role. So acknowledging, hey, you've had a home office for 3 years. Maybe you've done some things differently. What in that space has helped you be successful? Let's take an inventory of all of that and then see what can be translated over into the office. Obviously, for folks who are like, well, I get to like have my dog on my lap while I'm doing work, right? Like, can't translate all of those things. But one of the things that I advocate for with businesses is normalizing accommodations. Needs are an absolutely normal human thing. All humans have them. So when I hear about companies being like, well, nobody's come to me with any needs, that just tells me that it's not been a safe environment. People have those needs. They just don't feel safe enough to express them. So one shift can be, instead of people feeling singled out by like, ooh, I have to put my hand up, if there is a practice of just blanket inviting everyone to share what are the support systems that help you be successful in your role, right? Like that's, yeah, I want my employees to be successful in their role. That's what accommodations are. So that's one thing I think, in inviting everyone to be thoughtful about that. So that regardless of identity, diagnosis, anything, like nobody has to kind of out themselves in that way. They just say like, oh, okay, I need these tools. Just like we use mice and I have this like thing for my wrist to rest on, right? Like that helps me do my job well.
Mhm.
Just like all kinds of things.
Right.
Computers versus typewriters, right? So that's one piece. I think another piece is what when I'm a fierce advocate for is curiosity over assumptions. And so again, that doesn't necessarily only apply to neurodivergent folks, that applies across the board. But when we have interactions with people where, maybe they're not making eye contact, or maybe they said something directly and the first thought is like, ooh, wow, that's rude. I encourage folks to practice curiosity over, wow, they must be having a bad day, or they're angry at me, or wow, what a bee. Like, I can't believe they talked to me like that. Right? Like those are assumptions made based on sometimes ways of communicating, or ways somebody, just answered the question in a reply email rather than like, hey, I hope this email finds you well. I read your question. Here's the answer, right?
Right.
Like sometimes we don't have time for that. So if there is an approach of curiosity that can allow a person, give them a couple of beats to think like, okay, that was a really direct answer. Is there any reason why this person should be mad at me? No, we haven't interacted. Like, okay, can I like have a neutral response rather than assuming a negative response about them? Things like a lot of neurodivergent folks struggle with eye contact, and maintaining eye contact. That takes a certain amount of energy for us. So much of what we do is about energy conservation. So that can be read by others as, ooh, they're not making eye contact, they're being disrespectful, or they're shifty, or there must be dishonest about something, right? And then another piece I have to address here is, if those things get read a certain way for me as a white person, there are additional elements of like danger and harm when those things are read with a person like for instance, a Black woman who is read as like, wow, they're very direct and don't make eye contact. There's those racial elements
Yeah.
that are, another layer of discrimination on top, which that's a whole other topic about, like what the police need to know about neuroinclusion to save lives.
Yeah.
But maybe we'll have another chat about that.
Yeah.
But this is part of why, like, neurodiversity intersects with every other race, gender, religion, age, ability, sexuality, right? Like, not every facet of diversity intersects every other one, like neurodiversity.
Yeah.
And so when I talk about this, like, creating neuroinclusive environments is burnout prevention. Creating neuroinclusive environments is building a culture of belonging where people feel like, oh, hey, my way of being in the office is accepted, is okay, is not ostracized or constantly questioned or giving me bad marks on employee reviews because, I think and operate differently, right? Yeah, I'll let you
Yeah.
check in.
No, I was just gonna say, I think, and what I'm hearing you saying consistently is empathy goes such a long way.
Mm-hmm.
And I often say that too, and I'll say that to close friends and family members. And if you're in a disagreement, and I'll say, always assume positive intent. Like, I'm just that kind of person that I never want to assume that someone just intentionally went in to kill. Like, yeah. I mean, yeah, there may be some circumstances where someone intentionally meant to say something to hurt you or may have been rude, or there could be, but I think for 95% of the time there's underlying things that led up
Mm.
to whatever it is, or there's some mental imbalances that led up to whatever that is. So if we just show empathy for one another and always assume positive intent and ask the questions or just show grace to someone, because you never know what people are going through.
Yeah.
It just means so much to people.
Yeah, I have had the experience of, just I think I have a maybe like a resting furrowed face when I'm like concentrating or thinking and I'm like and I've had like coworkers walk by like, "Whoa, what is your deal?" And I'm like, I'm
Yeah.
just working. What
Just
do you mean? What is my deal? And they're like, well, your face is telling me, well, okay, my face is doing whatever my face is doing. And right, like that's where the curiosity and empathy comes in to like check it out with someone. If you feel like there is a rude or short or angry response, check in with them. Like, hey, how we interacted this morning, I just wanted to check in with you. How are you doing? Are you okay? It just seemed like a different tone than how we usually talk together. So I just wanted to touch base, see how you're doing, right? Like that's what curiosity can do. And like you said, you have no idea what a person is going through and what happened on the way to work or what happened before work or what they're carrying with them, that they're managing as they're trying to perform their duties, which is another piece to me of neuroinclusion around. We have to make it more like there's this movement happening right around cultivating psychologically safer spaces at work. And part of that is making it safer for people to show up as a more whole human being.
Yeah.
Like, you don't just get this one part of my brain that does these tasks. I'm a whole person.
Mhm.
And yes, there are certain things around like having boundaries around what you talk about or process emotionally at work versus at home. I have respect for that. But that's different than, I think, some of the pressure for us to disintegrate ourselves, to compartmentalize, only bring forward this piece at work and leave all the rest of you at the door. And that just is not like that. That's not how humans work. and and that's not sustainable. And that's part of what can lead to burnout, is when we don't have ways to use all the parts of our brain. For some folks, like especially for neurodivergent folks, sometimes we have very varied strengths, right? Like, I love a good spreadsheet. It's beautiful, it's ordered, it is just lovely. I love creativity, thinking outside of the box, outside of the spreadsheet, right? My brain has those two sides of itself. And I can do spreadsheet kind of data entry work all day long, but also my brain gets hungry for creative, innovative, strategic thinking. Let's imagine solutions to problems. And when there's a diversity of my role that I can put my brain to work in those different ways, that is nourishing to me. And for many people, we need, like the variety of activities to be doing throughout the day.
Yeah, I think that's just more common that's just human ability, right? Like, I think it's just everyone. I tell people all the time, before I went full time in entrepreneurship, I did pretty well in corporate. And what I feel like I did best once I got into the director C-suite level was hiring people who were passionate in that area of what I needed at that time in the business, right? Because it was important to me that they were allowed to do whatever they needed to do in that space to be successful. And what I quickly learned was, when you just hired people to fill a role, and you just hired them that because they were qualified, they had all the degrees, the salary was there, and they just needed a job, it never really worked out for the long term of the company, because they just needed a job, right? But the qualifications weren't number one on my list once they got in the door of understanding, right? So I would give people that chance, like, to understand, because there's people that are passionate. It's funny. I was an accounts payable clerk, and I remember once I was talking to a colleague. I was in an environment that was a sweatshop, and she knew everybody in it was looking for a job. So she was like, "What kind of jobs are you looking for?" I was literally applying for the CFO at companies. Like, this was not a joke. And she thought it was the funniest thing. And I was like, I'm driven. I've known I wanted to be an accountant since I was 16. I can surely be trained to be a CFO one day. Like, I didn't care the big gap that was in between, right? Now, of course, realistically, no one was going to hire me for that role. But if they gave me the opportunity to come in and explain myself, they may have hired me for a more advanced role that I wasn't quite ready for, based on my drive that I had alone, based upon, because they saw how passionate or what my needs were. So I think it's the same of what you're saying. Hire people and then let them do the job. Let them get the result the way they need to. Let them get to the conclusion the way that they need to.
Yes. All of what you're saying is so important for like the hiring and recruiting process.
Yep.
And again, neuroinclusion doesn't just benefit neurodivergent people, it benefits everyone. And I'm excited that I'm hearing about more companies who are taking that approach that you described to, hey, what are the things that you're great at? Let's assign you those tasks, versus here's the job description. Do you fit it perfectly? I'm also seeing more companies having kind of a blurb at the end of their job postings that's like, hey, so studies show that women and BIPOC and LGBTQ folks are less likely to apply for a job that they don't have all the exact qualifications for, but we want you to apply for it anyway, like some version of that, much more
Yeah.
eloquent, which I appreciate because it is true. If I don't exactly match all of the things, I'm like, well, that's not for me. And 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 yet there are so many transferable skills, right? I may not have held a certain position,
Mm-hmm.
but all of my years of experience as a therapist and
Mm-hmm.
doing all kinds of random jobs. I have one of the most random resumes ever. But like I was talking to somebody the other day, I was like, yeah, like I ran an ice cream shop for 2 years. There are skills that I take from that experience that I still use today, in whether that's customer service or hiring and training employees and dealing with conflict resolution, right? Like those are still transferable. Now, am I going to run an ice cream shop again ever in life? I don't know. I don't necessarily see that, but I use those skills. And I think that's a thing that is often a challenge for neurodivergent folks who a lot of times I hear from people, they're like, trying to find a job is so difficult. I feel like I'm simultaneously overqualified and underqualified for everything. Like I have this specific set of skills in which I excel and am amazing at, but there aren't always jobs that are this particular combination, right? So a lot of neurodivergent folks may have a history of having created a position that they then filled because their systems analysis brain was in the workplace, and they realized, what, we really need a position to serve this function in the company, and that would benefit, improve processes, improve productivity or whatever, and they pitch it and the company's like, oh yeah, you're right, cool, and then they fill that position. um I have done that myself. I have heard that from so many other folks. So that's another piece of kind of um, loosening some of the ways that things have been done, right? Neurodivergence is all about diverging
Yeah.
from the norm
Right.
and being open to, there are really infinite possibilities for how we can do something.
Right.
Let's explore them.
Yeah, exactly. And I love that. So my last question before we wrap is, could you recommend any resources or books for anyone that's listening or watching that may be interested in learning more about neuroinclusion, accessibility, and just supporting the neurodiverse individuals?
Absolutely. And some of them are not going to come to mind. I happen to have this one right next to me. I Will Die on This Hill. It's by an indigenous autistic person, and another, like several autistic people who are also parents of autistic children. And so it's kind of a different approach to parenting, as like parenting in a neurodivergent affirming way for a neurodivergent family. Another book is, and I can share links in the comments to
Mhm.
this live so folks can have access. Another resource is, I think it's called Neurodiversity Workplace Rising by Lyric Rivera. Um, again, talking about neuroinclusion. Let me see my shelf. There's several other, and there continue to be more books that are coming out. I think my main piece of advice is, when you are searching for resources on neurodivergence, be mindful to vet that the resource is written by an actually autistic person or actually ADHD person. There is a lot of content that has been put out by non-neurodivergent or non-autistic ADHD people um, about us. And, kind of go back to that disability justice phrase, nothing about us without us.
Mhm.
So one way to vet resources is look at who the authors are, check into their identity. Many of us are super open about our neurodivergence. So it will be relatively easy to find out, is this author autistic? Is this author ADHD? If you're looking at conferences, look at who the speakers are. Are there actually neurodivergent people who are keynote speakers, who are panelists, who are the stakeholders of the conference? I recently encountered a conference that was around autism, and I was looking at the stakeholders, pharmaceutical companies, and like autism treatment companies, and I was like, ooh, yeah, this feels bad. I don't want to give my money to this because this is just not. This is not in a direction that I work with and that I want to support around. The idea that this is a disease that needs to be treated medically or whatever. So vet your resources. I have an article about that on my LinkedIn profile about how to vet some resources. And like I said, I will share some links of some of my favorite books. I just didn't have all the titles at top of mind.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And if anyone wants books or other resources, feel free to reach out and DM Jennifer, and I'm sure she'll be happy to respond and give those to you. So
Yeah.
I think, I don't know, that's it for the questions and the curiosities that I had. I hope everyone found this to be a great resource of information for you. Jennifer is on all social media platforms. Her name's on the screen. You guys can look her up. She's pretty easy to find. As we close out, I'd like you to close and just let everyone know what your business expansive expressions, I think is what how you can be of service to them. Let them know your information and how to reach you.
Thank you. I absolutely love talking about this, as you can tell from this conversation. So I love coming to conferences and events and talking about neuroinclusion, whether that's in a conversational podcast style or in a speaking role. I love doing trainings and workshops. I have a couple of trainings coming up this fall. One, I'm collaborating with an ERG group. So if you're an ERG leader looking for content for your activity calendar, and then kind of the biggest option of all is consulting, where we look at those, like you said, those deeper things of like, let's look at your policies and see where we can make some changes. Let's dig in, right? That's a much more involved process. So anything from training, speaking, consulting. I also contract with companies to coach their neurodivergent employees in how to help them work with their brains to be the most successful that they can.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Jennifer.
Thank you, Kellé.
I'm so excited that I've had you. I'd love to have you back again and we talk more about this.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Until next time. Bye, guys.